game-changing discussions on the big ideas that shape our thinking. This is One-to-One. Previously on One-to-One.
You must recognize that if you are doing very well domestically, your foreign policy would also reflect it. So if you have challenges that you're not able to address within, you will muddle through. You may not be as assertive as you should be. So that's the situation with many countries in Africa, including South Africa, including Egypt, including Kenya, and so on. So we find ourselves at a point where we are resetting and reformatted, to be able to deal with the changing dynamics and to make optimal use of the opportunities on offer.
Let me press a bit further on that point. I'd like to correlate this with the rise, the ascendancy of nationalism, and perhaps populism side by side with that, as we see on the African continent and then perhaps elsewhere. Is this, certainly within Africa, in light of the things you just said, a welcome development? And actually more to the point, do you expect that this new wave is sustainable, or do you expect that the global orthodoxy will reassert itself at some point?
Well, the point is this, that scholars of international relations are the first to admit, that the analysis take their bearings, from the overriding interests of the superpowers in the world. So the other things come like, these are dependent things, dependent formations, and so on the ones that are hegemonic. Now, so if you take the analysis from that standpoint, you will find that beginning with the United States, but all through Europe, the rebirth, of ultranationalism, the right wing, ascendancy all over, has meant first that people are now more conscious of the fact that, these are our countries. In spite of globalization, we must protect and defend their territories. It's us first. Every other thing is secondary. And that also means that there are border closures. You want to prevent people from coming in as much as possible. Now, before now, the more strategic countries had deployed, certain templates for dealing with irregular migration and illegal migration. So you have the migration policy that is very deliberate, that allows you to make optimal use of brain drain and so on. So you select people on your own terms, whereas the counterweight of that, which is represented by irregular migration, is that from the global south, there are movements there on their own terms. So it's quite some kind of thing that requires some resolution. And you would find that bodies like the EU have moved into Africa to streamline migration policies and prevent so-called, illegal migration to Europe. Now, in the face of all of this, we also have seen, for instance, from the point of view of regular migration and brain drain and all of that, there are trade-offs, but there are benefits. So that, for instance, today we're able to talk about the funds, that come from the diaspora communities. Those funds are huge. If you go to many cities in Nigeria, you would see, what, the money has been used for.
Sure.
You see, unbelievable extensions, especially in the real estate sector. There are, all kinds of things everywhere. And for many families, if they didn't have such things coming from abroad, the poverty levels would be much worse. So that is so. But, we therefore thought that globalization, was something to embrace. And for many of us, it was a new form of thinking that accepted unbridled globalization. But today, there are things that are beginning to make us realize that maybe we should rethink, some of those things that we've talked about. American policies increasingly would encourage deglobalization. Make America great again simply means, America first, America second, and America only.
Absolutely.
And that is going on. So as we begin to rethink this sense, maybe it's the time to say BRICS is offering a de-dollarization possibility. That's something to consider. If the big powers, as we know them, are no longer as amenable to supporting Africa the way we would want, there are other countries that are coming up. India is one, South Korea is another, China is in the forefront, Singapore, all of these countries, going back to Bolaji Akinyemi's concept of medium powers, there's a lot that can be done without waiting for the United States or the Western nations to come to lead us. So I think, nationalism, let's take the African flank of nationalism, is a big problem because we have states that have not quite become nations. So we are in that struggle. You would find that African states that have managed to get notions of being collective countries with common good and so on have progressed better than those that are still struggling, with those very fundamental issues of the national question. So, for instance, if you take Botswana doesn't seem to have the kinds of diversities, that many other countries in Africa suffer from. If you take South Africa, it has its diversity, but what is clear is that the liberation struggle, was a good vehicle for putting a sense of nationhood, so many South Africans, are still able to defend the interests of their countries in the ways that many other countries are not able to do. So I think that the first thing that we really need to do without getting reductionist is to say we need to work on our nationhood as a people. Nationalism meant the struggle for independence. Now we have independence. The kind of nationalism that we're talking about is the one that makes us one people, serves us as a commonwealth, where we have things in common. Because you see, because we haven't quite attained that, most of the times our relationships with the state are very opportunistic. And, so it's like everything to get from the state, but nothing to give to the state. That's still very problematic. But I will close this part of it by reminding us that, our nationalists that long ago were part of the problem. In the bid to demarket the colonial state, people, as citizens, were encouraged not to pay taxes. Because the whole idea was to say, you're paying tax to somebody who is exploiting you and oppressing you and so on,
Occupying you.
So people thought it was the right thing not to pay taxes. So now suddenly you have taken over. And, to change that narrative, it's very difficult. But you see, you cannot change that narrative except and until you have let the people see that, you see, this country is their country. So if it doesn't work, if it's not prosperous, we'll all just sink and die. But where we are is there are those who say, yes, this country is our country, but it is what it has that makes us part of it. And that's what we'll go for. And that's why we have corruption as an industry. Everyone is, going into the state to enrich everyone. So those kinds of things can only stop if we have a different sense of nationalism.
On to my next question. Thinking about you, sir, as an inspiration, as the Director General of the NIIA, and thinking about many who would want or who might have wanted a career in the diplomatic service. I remember, actually, it was once upon a time a particular passion of mine. I was convinced I was going to go into the foreign service, and I can imagine that there were many young people who, in those days, had that desire. But things appear to be changing. It appears that perhaps a career in the diplomatic service may not be quite as appealing as it once was, or certainly hasn't been as popular people to get into. Is this because of the way things are changing in our country, or what would you say about that?
Well, I mean, you see, what hasn't changed in our country? The lenses that we had that long ago are no longer the same lenses. I mean, take the teaching profession, for instance, which used to be quite attractive. People didn't go into teaching because they expected that in teaching they would become very rich people. There was, a noble cause, calling, for teaching. People went into the police force, into the army, into those places, not because they expected they were going to become, very wealthy. For many of them, it was, the national cause, the call to duty, which was a good thing, and so on. So the diplomatic service was always the most elitist, of all the services. It was not an all-comers vocation. It was something that, we carefully selected people into. The requirements, the qualifications were some of the highest, at the time. It's always been so. And that's universal, that's global, that's what everyone does. So it's not always had the outlook of what you might call a populist, sector. So it's still there. And some of the greatest diplomats that the world has ever known have come from Nigeria. I mean, from the days of Sip Adebo to the days of Ibrahim Gambari, to the days of Amina Mohammed, who is there today, in the AU, in the UN, and our ambassadors have been great people. So that's one area where Nigeria has done very well. But, as you know, I said to you before we came on this program, even now, it's never too late. You're a medical doctor. We'll be glad to have you as an ambassador. Why not? It's something that we have always taken very seriously. And we recognize that when you have great diplomats for it. It makes the country even greater.
Absolutely. I would like very briefly to return to your time at the Igbenedion University. Of course, 14 years as Vice Chancellor. You brought to the role a wealth of experience from a variety of sectors, but mainly academia, of course. That was, Igbenedion University remains the first privately funded university in Nigeria. Am I correct? How did you find at the time that it compared with the University of Ibadan and Lagos, and what did you feel you had to do to bring up the standard, if that's the right context? And what would you consider your greatest achievement as VC?
It's easier to answer that last question. I'm not going to be able to talk about my achievements at all, as I would not talk about my greatest achievement, but people who know the university and take it, in historical perspective, can pass those judgments. I did everything that I had to do to grow the university to a formidable global university standard. That's what I would say there.
But I think you answered the question already. You said people, and the university system is about building people.
Yes, but
and you talked about growing it into becoming a formidable.
Well, that's fine. I'm
university.
happy to say so. But let me say, that I was in the saddle between 2004 and 2018. It's incredible how things change so fast. Today, there are probably 100 private universities and more in Nigeria. I imagine, if I was Vice Chancellor at this time, what would I be doing or thinking? Yeah, because, when I was Vice Chancellor in 2004, we were only two private universities with medicine. Only two. And even that long ago, thank God you're a medical practitioner, it was difficult to find consultants and specialists in several of the fields and subfields. In chemical pathology, for instance, you could count only a handful, of the guys. And yet, from the Medical and Dental Council of Nigeria's perspective and from the NUC's perspective, you needed to have professors, you needed to have, we were competing with the more established universities for the very few people. Now, I imagine that, today there are over 60 private universities with medicine. Where would they get the people from? Now, so one of the things that, we did, very early was to set up a staff development program. And that helped. Many of the guys, that entered our staff development program, would come in when they become specialists and so on, they would run away. But, we at least had that foundation. Now, but I think the greatest impetus for many of the things that I personally would look back and say we did was the proprietor of the university, Chief Igbenedion himself, who, when I became Vice Chancellor, would ask me, do you think this university is lower than the University of Ibadan? I said, no. He says, why? I said, because a university is a university. And, that actually was a strong motivation for him, to say that, these other universities are not better than us. I said, no, sir. As a matter of fact, and I did this out of conviction. I said to him, the future of the university sector in Nigeria lies in the private universities. There's no way the public universities are going to be able to compete with the private universities in the long run. And that's already beginning to happen. I mean, see, the other day we had COVID. There's Professor Happy, who is a Redeemers University. All of those things that, became African scientific and medical contributions to the narratives on COVID came from Redeemers and the laboratory that you have there.
Absolutely.
I mean, and that's a private university. So private universities have excelled. I mean, at Igbenedion, we were the first university in Nigeria to produce medical doctors, from the private sector. And we had doctors everywhere. In fact, it's the strongest program that we had in the university. Don't forget that, Igbenedion already had a specialist, hospital that was state of the art before, the university was established. So I would say that, one of the things that I thought helped us in the university was coming from my comparative politics background. I didn't want to be a copycat, because people would say to me, the way it's done in UNN or in Ibadan or in Benin and so on. So I said, no, I want people from those universities to say, we want to do what they are doing in Igbenedion. So this was my driver all the time. I never want to emulate or imitate, what my children call, don't be a copycat. No, I can't be a copycat. So Igbenedion was never a copycat. And you find that in the moniker, for us was Igbenedion University, authentic. So we were authentic, in every material particular. But I think that, the challenges were enormous. First was that we had a perception that was very common, that private universities were inferior. And there were places where the kinds of things that should not go on in a normal university could happen. So, for instance, there were people who applied to me to be employed as lecturers, and they had HND. So I said to the guys, but you're applying to me, you have HND. HND is a very good qualification, but it is not a qualification for lecturing in university. And they will say to me, oh, we thought it is different in private universities. Now, so that was a perception thing. But quite early, I could see that because the private university was the future of the university sector in the country, I thought if we didn't have the necessary interventions, the private universities would become a way of extending the gulf between the rich and the poor. So I had gone to a foundation to say, support my work at the university. And they say, no, that would be a contradiction in terms. I say, why? They say, because they are poor. And a private university, by definition, is not just elitist, it's poor rich. So I said, fine. So they give me a clue to what I thought, would, bring these things together. So I said, if the poor cannot be in the private university, then it remains the exclusive preserve of the rich. It means that if the private universities then become the future, as they already have become, then the poor would never have any position. So I wrote to all of the state governments in Nigeria. And I said to them, here's the point. The national elite is going to come from graduates of the private universities. And if you guys don't support people, ordinary poor people from your states, you would exclude them, from that elite, from the national elite of the future. And I'm telling you, many of those progressive governors embraced this and brought their students to us. When the amnesty program, came on board, and the guys were saying we need to ensure that these people get education and so on, and people were so I went to Amnesty International. I said, give me the students, give me these militants, I will transform them. So there were very bold steps that we took as a university. They paid off, thank God. But we had the great motivation was to say we are better, no, not better. We are not just as well, not just as good as the more established universities. They should come to emulate us. And I think that many private universities, and they are grateful to us as the Millennium University. Today, the 100 and more private universities never forget to say thank you for showing us the way. I mean, so they're all there today, and the people are confident they can send their children to those schools because, Millennium University was successful.
Absolutely. If I were to ask you to name one person who you believe has been absolutely pivotal to the trajectory and the development of our foreign diplomacy in this country, who would that be?
Very interesting. Because this was very foundational, and because these were not things that you expected to find at the time. In other words, exceptionalities, peculiarities, would be Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. Because, in their time, he didn't have the kind of privileged education that Nnamdi Azikiwe had. He didn't go to school the way Obafemi Awolowo did. He was not like Herbert Macaulay. He was a teacher, and he had only gone for a certificate course in the United Kingdom, in London, for a few months and so on. But he had an amazing understanding of the global environment. And, he immersed himself within it. And like I say, he was first foreign minister, first minister, and he did exceptionally well. And he had quite a courage, a dignified courage. He was spoke Queen's English at the time. He spoke real good. Was a broadcaster, well, own and very happy. Very happy. That's the word. And he was a great guy. I think, because he was one of the founding fathers of the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, that he didn't work alone, but that team was fantastic, But the one that gave intellectual drive, and took us to the place where the Kissingers would have said, come on, wait a minute, what's coming out of Nigeria? Give it to Bolaji Akinyemi and Ibrahim Gambari.
And on that note, Professor Eghosa Osaghae, it has been an immense pleasure, a most informative conversation I've had with you today. It has been a privilege to talk to you in one-to-one. Thank you so very much, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right.